5th grade, this video is for April 27th. Today we're going to continue in chapter 13, but before we do, I want to talk a little bit about a verse that was mentioned last week that Abraham Lincoln had used. The verse is from Matthew 12:25, and this was Jesus speaking, and he said, knowing their thoughts, he said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand. This was a response that Jesus made in reference to some Pharisees that had basically accused him of casting out demons by the power of Satan. And Jesus said, well, if I was using Satan's power, why would I want to cast out demons, basically? And he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So if he was wanting to do things that would benefit Satan, why would he be casting out demons? It wouldn't be any benefit. And he said, you can't have it both ways. You can't be working against something and then try to be for it as well. So what Abraham Lincoln was saying when he used that verse was that our country, as we talked about before, was not going to be able to remain half slave and half free. It had to become all one thing or all the other, or our country would fall apart altogether. And so we're going to continue in chapter 13 on pages 209 and 210 today. So go ahead and follow along with me. At the top of page 209, the Civil War, a divided country, its soldiers. The Union troops. When Abraham Lincoln asked for soldiers, thousands volunteered. The Northern soldiers wore blue uniforms. Besides being called the Union troops, they were sometimes called the Yankees, the Yanks, or the Billy Yanks. So here I have a picture of a Union soldier in his blue uniform with the American flag. Now, it would not have had 50 stars back then. And then we know that the Union states were the northern states, the states that stayed with the Union. They stayed part of the United States. And the Union soldiers were nicknamed Yankees, Yanks, or Billy Yanks. Maybe you thought Yankees was only the name of a baseball team in New York, but it's not. It was what the Union soldiers were called. The Confederate troops. The South called for soldiers, and thousands of men volunteered to join the Confederate Army. They wore a gray uniform. Their own Confederate flag waved in the breeze. The Southern Confederate soldiers were sometimes called rebels or Johnny Rebs. So over here I have the Confederate soldier in his gray uniform with the Confederate flag. So the Confederates were the Southern states that left the Union. Their soldiers were nicknamed rebels or Johnny Rebs. So on this map, I'm showing you the states that stayed with the Union, the northern states, and then the states that left the Union, the southern states. And as you can see, our state, California, was a state at that time, and it stayed with the Union. It remained part of the United States, but there was no fighting during the Civil War on this side of our country. All of the fighting was over on the other eastern half of our country. And the states that are not marked were not states yet. This area was not settled as states yet. The first battle. The United States Army owned several forts located in the Confederate States. The Confederate government demanded that these forts and their guns be given to the Confederate States. Of course, the United States would not give up her forts. So remember, all of these states were once part of the United States. So there were forts in these states where guns and other equipment were stored. And so when these states left the Union, when they became part of the Confederacy, these states demanded that these forts give up their guns and other arms to the Confederates. Well, of course, the Union said, no, we're not going to let you just take over these forts and take out all of those guns and weapons and everything. Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, stands on a man-made island of rock in Charleston Harbor. The Confederates wanted to remove the Union soldiers from Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter belongs to us, the Confederates claimed. Okay, so here's South Carolina. So Fort Sumter was off the coast of South Carolina. Well, since that's in Confederate territory, they said that fort belongs to us. We should be able to have all of the guns and weapons and everything in that fort for our use. Well, the Union government was not just going to hand it over, and so the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Early on an April morning in 1861, Confederate troops aimed their guns at Fort Sumter. Although it was still dark, the people of Charleston came out of their houses to watch. At 4:30 in the morning, the Confederates fired the first shot. This shot began the Civil War. So by the Confederates firing on Fort Sumter to try to take over that fort, that began the first battle of the Civil War. The Union troops inside Fort Sumter had few supplies. They fought for 2 days, but at last they had to surrender the fort. The United States flag was taken down from the fort, and the Confederate flag was raised in its place. So after 2 days of trying to fight off the Confederates, the Union forces inside the fort had to surrender. They couldn't defend themselves any longer, and so the United States flag was lowered and the Confederate flag was raised over Fort Sumter, and the Confederates were able to take over the fort and get all of the weapons and guns and ammunition and everything that was inside the fort. The Confederates cheered, for they had won the first battle of the war. Little did they realize what a long, horrible war lay before them. They thought the North would not want to keep fighting. They also thought that England and France would come to help them, but the Confederates were wrong. So they had no idea what a long, terrible war, as we just read, was before them. They thought they would get outside help from countries like England and France. They thought the North would not want to keep fighting and that they would have victory and they would be able to remain the Confederate States of America. But that wasn't to be. You can look at the picture at the bottom of page 209. It says the first shot of the Civil War was fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Let's go on to page 210. The Union must be saved. The battle at Fort Sumter saddened President Lincoln. He knew that the Union must be saved, even if it meant war. He asked for 75,000 Union men to volunteer as soldiers. Within days, thousands of men volunteered to join the Union Army. So President Lincoln sent out a call for men to volunteer and join the Army, and thousands of men did. The Confederacy grows. The southern states of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had not joined the Confederacy. When President Lincoln's call for soldiers came, these states could not bear the thought of fighting against their own southern neighbors. Instead, they left the Union and joined the Confederate States. So after President Lincoln's call for more Union soldiers, those states decided that they too would join the Confederacy. So all of these states with lines through them became the Confederate States of America. The Confederate government now represented 11 states. The Union government represented 22. So there were twice as many Union states, twice as many states that stayed with the Union as there were Confederate states. There were only 11 Confederate states. There were 22 Union states. And now I'm going to show you some graphs that give you just a little bit of a better idea of what the South, what the Confederate States were up against as they took on the Union and fought in the Civil War. All right, now I'd like us to take a look at some graphs, as I said, that are going to show you the differences in the way the northern states, the Union, and the southern states, the Confederacy, were equipped to fight the war. So the Union and the Confederacy in 1861, this is the beginning of the war. It says, look at the graphs below to compare the resources each side had. So let's take a look, first of all, and notice that the blue is going to represent the Union, and the yellowish color, brownish color is going to represent the Confederacy. So the first graph shows us the number of states, which we just talked about. So the Union, remember, had a total of 22 states, while the Confederacy had only 11. So there were twice as many Union states as there were Confederate states. So you can see an advantage that the Union had already, can't you? Next, this graph shows us population. So in those 22 Union states, there were over 20 million people. In the Confederate states, the southern states, there were fewer than 10 million people. So quite a difference in population. And then the next graph shows us the number of soldiers. The Union had almost 2 million, or right around 2 million soldiers, while the Confederacy, the southern states, had fewer than 1 million, probably more like around 800,000 or somewhere around there, but not a million. Okay, getting the picture of how the South was not very well equipped to fight against the North. Let's look at the next one, factories. We talked about that a lot early on in chapter 13. So again, in the North, in the Union states, there were over 100,000 factories. In the South, in the Confederate States, maybe 10,000. You know, look at the small number that was. So not very many factories at all. So the North had factories where they could produce guns and ammunition. They could produce cloth to make uniforms for the soldiers. They were much better equipped. All right, next, farms. In the North, remember, they had small farms, but look how many they had. They had 1,500,000, while in the South, in the Confederate States, they had only a little over 500,000. And on the farms that they did have, what were they growing? Right, cotton and tobacco. That was not going to feed hungry soldiers, was it? So the farms in the North, in the Union states, were going to help feed those soldiers and help keep the people fed during that time. Then the next graph shows us railroads, and this shows us miles of railroad. And we can see that the northern states had over 20,000 miles of railroads, while the southern states had fewer than 10,000 miles. And that would be important because if you wanted to transport men, if you needed to transport troops, or you needed to transport goods, the Union was much better equipped to do that than the Confederacy. They had fewer miles of railroad that would help them to transport people or goods. So as we look at those graphs, we see that the Confederate States were outnumbered in every category. They had fewer resources. However, they fought very long and very hard. It's amazing that they were able to hold out against the Union as long as they were, and that shows how dedicated and determined they were to their cause. Whether it was right or not, they still were very dedicated and very determined to fight. Next time, we'll go on and we'll look at a blockade that President Lincoln ordered to have in the coast along the southern states, and a battle between some two very unusual ships. Thanks for watching this video. See you next time.